The box model is one of the most fundamental parts of CSS. That's because it's the main factor that defines how elements are displayed on a web page and also how they are sized. So, according to the box model, each and every element on a web page can be seen as a rectangular box. And each box can have a width, a height, padding, margins, and a border. And we can specify all these using CSS properties. But note that they are all optional. So there can be boxes with no margins or no paddings or no border at all. Now this image here shows us how the box model works. And so let's break it down. First, the content of a box is where all the text, images, and other content that we specify goes. We can easily define its height and width using the corresponding CSS properties. Next, the padding is a transparent area around the content, but still inside of the box. And we use paddings to create white space inside of a box, and we can define the padding by specifying the padding property in CSS. Next, we can specify a border for any box, and that border then goes around the padding and the content. And this actually we already did in the last lecture, right? Then, similar to the padding, we have the margin. But instead of being inside the box, the margin is white space that's actually outside of the box itself. So we can think of margin as the space between boxes. So for instance, if we want to create some space between two elements, we will simply use their margin properties in CSS. And finally, there is something called the fill area. So remember how the text content and images go inside the content box? Well, the same does not apply for background images or the background color of a box. These properties will actually be applied not only to the content box, but to the entire fill area, which also includes the padding and the border, but not the margin. Okay? All right, so let's go back to our code and implement some of these properties. Now, if we take a look at our page here, we will see that actually there's already a lot of space here, right? For example, between this heading and this paragraph, and here is space, and here, and there's also a lot of space around this H2 element here, and that's because by default, some elements get some margin automatically if we don't define them, okay? Now that can create some problems when we're trying to style our page, and so usually what we do is that we reset all of the margins and all of the paddings on all elements before doing anything else. So this is called a global reset. And so to do that, we need to select all the elements. And for that, we have a special selector. And that is the star selector. Okay, so again, with this, we can select all the elements on the page. So what we do then is to set the margin to 0 pixels. And when we use 0, we don't even need to specify the unit. So just 0 like this. And the same for padding set to 0 as well. If I give it a save now, it looks like this. So all the paddings and all the margins are effectively gone. And that's exactly what we wanted. Now we also need to add another property here. I mean, we do not have to, but we usually always do, which is the box sizing property set to border box. Okay, now this will not change anything here, and I'm not going to go into detail what this does. I'm just putting it here so that you know that we always use it. Okay, so essentially what this does is that it will include paddings and borders into the width or the height that we specify for an element. So for example, if we specify the width of an element to 100 pixels and then add a padding of 20 pixels on each side, then 100 plus 20 would be a total width of 140 pixels, which could create problems if all we wanted was a width of 100 pixels. And so to fix this, we use box sizing set to border box. And so in this case, if we specify the width to 100 pixels, it will always be 100 pixels no matter how much the padding. Okay, and if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you at this point, then you can always Google around how it works if you want to go into more detail. But since this is just a crash course, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. So now what I want to do is to add back some margins and some paddings so that you can see how exactly they work. And let's actually add with the body, and here we will set some padding. Okay, and why do we use padding? Well, it's because we want to add some space inside of this body element. So basically to create some space between the border of the browser, so of this viewport, and the content. So let's set it to 75 pixels. And by the way, there are also other units in CSS. We don't always have to use pixels. We can use percentages or other more weird units like M or rem or points or anything like that. But to start out, it's easier to just understand with pixels. Okay, so give it a save. And so now you see that it added this nice space between the sides. Okay, it's maybe a bit too much. Let's put it back to like 50. Okay, and now let's move on and add some space between this heading here and this paragraph. And to do that, we can simply add some margin to the bottom of this H1. Okay, so we can specify paddings and margins like this. So as we did here, margin and padding, and that will then apply them to the 4 sides of the element. But we can also do that selectively to only the left side or the right side or the top side or the bottom side. And so let's now add margin to the bottom of H1. So margin and then bottom. And let's say 25 pixels, give it a save, and here we have, okay? Now, if we did padding here, it would actually look the exact same way. Let me show that to you. And indeed, it works the same way. But now this space is inside of the H1. Let me show that to you using the inspector. So this is the H1, and the green part is the padding. You can also see that here. So this is the content, and then we have 25 of padding. Then here you also have the border and then the margin outside of the border, so outside of the element. And essentially this is what we learned at the beginning of this video, right? But it makes more sense for this space actually to be outside of the element. And so a margin in this case makes more sense. And so you see that now this 25 is here painted in red, right? And so it's now outside of the element. Okay, so this Elements tab here in the developer tools is pretty useful to inspect so the styles of all the elements and also to check out the markup, so the HTML in here. We can turn on and off these different properties, and in general this is really helpful to work with HTML and CSS in the browser. Next up, we should probably also add some spacing after the H2 elements. So let's say margin bottom 20 pixels. Okay, and we can also do another thing that I didn't show you before, which is to set the text align property. So text align, and now we can set it to left, right, or center. And I want to set it to center here. And then, as you expect, the text will get centered here. So basically centered inside this whole box. So the H2 box, and again, we can see the box using the inspector. Okay, so the box itself is this whole blue space that we can see up there. And so the text of the H2 is then centered inside the H2 box. Okay, and remember that this is a block element. And so that's why it creates a box basically. So block elements are the elements that create their own line, and inline elements, remember, is like the link here. So if we inspect this one, you see that the box only occupies the space of the text itself, right? It doesn't create a whole box on a whole line. So that's the big difference between inline and block elements, all right? Okay, so this form here, of course, is also a block element. And so let's make it a little bit more narrow. And so, as we learned by the beginning of the lecture, we can do that using the width property. So let's set it to 400 pixels, and that looks a lot nicer. Okay, now we also want to create some space between all this content and the border. And so, how do we do that? Well, that's right, we have to use padding, because padding creates space inside of the box. And yes, indeed it does. And now let's also create some space between the image and this form here. Okay, and so here we can add some margin to the top. So margin top, and let's say, well, 50 pixels. Might be a bit too much. Yeah, let's just set it to 30 so we can see it. And now let me actually just show you what happens if we take out this property here. Okay, so we can comment it out just like we comment out code in JavaScript. So let's hit command slash. And so you see in CSS, the commands are like this. So slash star star slash and not slash slash. Okay. And so as I save now, take a close look here at this form. And you see that it now get wider. So let's inspect it here. So the form, we need to select the form here, and then scroll down. And so now you see what I explained earlier. So we defined the width as 400, but then we have a padding of 25 here, right? And so that then gets added to the total width of the element. So we have 400 plus 25 here plus 25 here, and then also 5 pixels border on each side. So 5 here and 5 here. And so that makes it then that the whole element adds up to 460 pixels, I would guess. So you can see that here on the screen, so up here, that it says that the width is actually 460, okay? And so again, that's because it adds up all the borders and the paddings to the width. And that's what happens without box sizing to border box. But if I put it back on, so again, command slash, if I save it now we are back to what we expected. So 400. So we set it here to 400, and so we wanted it to be exactly 400, and not for all the other stuff to be added. And so now, as you see here, it says 400. And so automatically CSS then changed the width of the content here to just 340 to accommodate the rest of the width, basically, that's needed for the padding and the border. Okay, so I said I wouldn't go into a lot of detail, but I guess I just did anyway. But anyway, let's now also add some margin to these paragraphs here. So I used the first class to select this paragraph and this paragraph. But now we want to select all 3 paragraphs. And so for that, we can simply use the P selector. And that will then select all of them regardless of any class names. Okay, so margin bottom, and let's set it to 10 pixels or 20 so we can see it a little bit better. And so you see that in fact, the margin now got applied to all 3 of these paragraphs just as we wanted. Next up, we can also select the input and the button. So here we have the input and the button elements, and we can also style them a little bit too. So let me actually show you another cool thing. So we have the input selector, but now we want these rules that we're going to write here to apply to both the input and the button. And so we can write input, comma, button. And so this rule here will then apply to both of these selectors. So let's add a padding of 10 pixels and increase the font size, let's say to 16 pixel. So look at them now. And indeed, they got bigger and they got this nice padding in there now. And once more, you can see that these 2 elements, so input and button, are inline elements. So this one and this one, they both don't create a box that occupies the whole line. So again, just like the link. And I can actually show that to you by styling just this link. So let's say a background color and set it to yellow. And then here you see, and at least I hope you can see it. Well, let's actually set it to yellow-green. I think that's another. Yes. And so now you can see it. And so the box now is only this element itself, but not the whole width of the screen. Okay. So actually, let's leave it like this so you can have this as a reference. And now to finish, I just want to show you one final but very important selector. And this one is actually pretty important for you to know because we're also going to use this all the time in JavaScript to select elements when we do DOM manipulation. Because in fact, all these selectors, the way they work in CSS, for example, the dot first, or here the ID selector, they're going to work just the same to select elements in JavaScript. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very important to learn how these selectors work. So anyway, the selector then I wanted to show you is the child selector. So the example I have here is that we have these two H2 headings. So this one and this one. But let's say I only wanted to select the H2 elements that are inside of this form here. Okay, so of course I could go ahead and add an ID or a class to this one. So here I could add an ID or a class, but I could also tell CSS to simply select this H1 that is inside of the element with the ID of your name. And so this is how it works. So again, we use the ID, your name. So just what we have here, and then a simple space, and then another selector. So in this case, that's simply the H2 selector, but it could be any other selector. So this here could also be a class selector or another ID selector, all right? But in this case, I just want to select the H2. And so let's change the color of this one, and let's change it to, I think there's one called olive, or let's use this one, olive drab. And yeah, indeed. Now this one is green and this one is not, because this one is not inside the element with the ID of your name, right? And so this one here is very useful, and we use it all the time in CSS. And so that's why I wanted to show you this one here as well. Finally, just to make this a little bit smaller, let's also change the size of the image, because that's also something very important. So if we do not specify any sizes on the image, it will simply be as large as it can, okay? Or as large as the source image really is. But usually we don't want that. So on the image, it's pretty common to always set either a height or a width attribute. So let's do that here. So this one doesn't have, or maybe it does have a class. So, oh, actually it has an ID, okay? So we can, of course, use the image selector like I was just writing, but we can also use the ID. So the difference is that with the ID, if we had multiple images, then we would only select this one. So let's actually copy this one and use this. So ID, and then the name of the ID. And let's set the width here to 200 pixels. So what do you think will happen then to the height? Well, it's scaled proportionally. Okay, so that's very nice. Let's make it a bit bigger, 300 pixels. And so we don't have to worry about the height. We can still set it, but with that we will then change the aspect ratio. So if we set the height to also 300 pixels, it should then become a square. Yeah, that's right. Okay, and if we now turn off the width, so let's comment it out, then it will again scale proportionately. So the height is now 300, and then the width is calculated automatically. Let's set it back, and usually it's easier to simply specify the width. Okay, so that looks nice. Let's change the H1 a little bit to 35 to make it fit all in one line. And yeah, we have a nice little page here. It's not the best looking, but I think it taught you some things about HTML and CSS, at least the very fundamentals. So of course we only scratched the surface here. So probably this is less than like 5% of everything that there is to learn about CSS. So we didn't really talk about positioning, we didn't talk about Flexbox or CSS Grid or many other important topics. But that wasn't also really the goal here. I just wanted to get you up to speed with the fundamentals of HTML and CSS so that you can understand a little bit of the code of the projects that I included here in the course, and also so that you can learn how these selectors work, because as I mentioned, we will use them in JavaScript to select elements as well. So I hope you liked this small crash course, and I also hope I got you interested in HTML and CSS so that you now go ahead and research maybe a little bit more about it. Anyway, with that being said, let's now go straight into DOM manipulation in the next section, because that's really exciting and really cool.